Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, he'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Lukes at the Crossroads for another interesting day. We're still going to be talking about money creation today and also the wholeness of society. And of course, these points are integrated. And yeah, we need to understand that. So, welcome, Betty from Adelaide.
Thank you, Annie. Good morning.
And Wally from Canada. Welcome, Wally.
Hi from Canada.
No
Pleased to
worries.
see the both of you.
That's it. All right. So I've actually given the game away with my little preamble there. But the important thing that I wanted to bring up here is that money is a system. It is a man-made system, and in its attempts to organise communities or assist communities to organise and keep a record of what's actually going on. Whereas in our society today, we consider money as a it has an intrinsic value in itself, and I think we're confused. And so what we've got to do is we've got to follow the history of this back. So I'll let Betty open the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Annie. um, in the last session, we dealt with the fact that if you go back to at least the Sumerian civilization, the owner of the wealth issued or created his own money tickets, and they were tokens representing his cattle. And in truth, this is the important part, in truth, not metaphorically, but literally, he made leather discs representing his wealth. And 1,000 years later, when he set up a colony in the Indus Valley, then they used clay tablets to register the fact. And while we don't have the evidence of the leather discs, because over time they would have just deteriorated, disintegrated, we do have the evidence of the clay discs. Now I want to bring you to the 15th and 16th centuries, because you can't really look at this in any one time. You've got to look at the development of understanding, the development of the civilization, all of those things. And if you go to the 15th and 16th centuries, you look at Europe and you see that it was rent by wars, and the chief owners of the wealth in that time were the feudal nobles, and their wealth was in the form of gold and silver plate and coins. Now, it was the goldsmiths of the time who made the gold and silver plate, where they were the artists of the time, and they made the gold and silver plate. Now, the nobles, the feudal nobles, deposited those plates in the goldsmiths' safes because it could easily have been stolen. And the goldsmiths issued receipts signed on parchment for the safekeeping of those of that wealth. In time, the receipts circulated as what we would say as money. If a noble wanted to purchase some land, he wouldn't bother taking his gold plate out of the goldsmith's safe. He would hand on the goldsmith's receipt as money. Now, such receipts were the direct lineal ancestors of today's banknotes. And you can watch a number of older movies and you can actually see it, that it was the banknote. The banknotes were accepted as money, but they were issued by the banking system itself. Now, the custodians of the wealth found that only about 10% would withdraw their wealth in any one day. And so fraudulently, the goldsmiths issued more receipts than they had gold or gold plate in their safekeeping. And that's how it changed from the owner of the wealth. It now changed to the custodian of the wealth issuing the money. And these are important facts to remember when you're thinking of the history of money. The goldsmiths signature on the parchment passed from hand to hand, and that was another epoch-making event. It was not the producer of the wealth, nor the owner of the wealth, but merely the custodian of the wealth who had the power to create money. And what happened is in World War One, or after World War One, the banknote nor the check cashable at any time had the signature of oh sorry, I've missed that point. And but it was that that's right. It was that the custodian of the wealth had on his note that at any time the bearer of that note could go to his safe for his safekeeping, and they could redeem their note by being paid in gold sovereigns.
Okay, thanks for that, Betty. I'm pleased with your, if you like, précis of the history of money in a simple form. Over to you, Wally.
Well, that's an interesting summary you've given, Betty, on the history of money. It's developed from cumbersome physical objects to the form of mere receipts, which are much more convenient. You cannot operate a complex or a modern economy on using tokens which are heavy in weight. No, you're looking for a representative system that simply represents your wealth. And money is simply a demand. It's an order system. And in other words, you can present your order and it will be honored. There is faith in it. If it's honored, that's an expression of faith. So basically, under the present system that we operate under what is called a creditary system. Producers borrow from the community, and they access real resources from the community, which allow them to go ahead with their program of production. But in doing that, they have an obligation, and they have to register that obligation in prices. And the consumer is expected to pay that the money to the producer, allowing him to recover his costs and to repay the issuer of credit, which is really the community. Now, the banks have assumed, as Betty said, I believe the banks have assumed the creation of credit. And it's not, when you go to a bank and you ask for a loan, you're actually giving them an order to produce money. It's not that they're just doing it on their own. You're giving them an order to do it. So it's not that the banks are creating the money. It's the fact, as we've mentioned before, that the banks actually claim the ownership of that credit. And Betty referred to the creation of receipts in excess of gold with regard to the old goldsmiths. And they were doing that same fraudulent thing at that time when they created money more than they actually had and claimed ownership of it because it was required to be paid back to them. On pain of not doing that, you would be foreclosed on, of course. So there's been quite an evolution there, and money is simply an absolutely essential abstract representation of what on an economic level we do in terms of production and consumption. And because of the way that we conduct our system of accountancy, cost accountancy in industry, we generate more costs by far and increasingly as we replace labor with technology, then we distribute in incomes. In other words, you're developing an increasing disparity between incomes and costs to be liquidated. And that's where the modern problem comes in. There simply isn't enough money that is available in any cycle of production to liquidate the costs of that cycle. and something has to intervene to make the thing work. And it's just simply the fact that we go to the banks and the banks create more money for more production or money to consumers as consumers loans, which is a mortgage upon future production and requires work to pay off.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's a very good summary of where we are in the situation in the current situation we find ourselves in. I find it fascinating that in the if you like the time of the leather discs or the clay tablets, um, the person who was responsible for producing these forms, these discs of representation or a claim on wealth, it was relative to the natural world. It was a reflection of the natural world, and there was actually an engagement. Money reflected a time of abundance and also a time of scarcity. If there was drought, pestilence, whatever, and the cattle numbers were down, the crops were failed, then obviously the claim against wealth had to be reduced, and so the issuing of those clay tablets or leather discs was obviously proportional. There was an equilibrium in it, and also point out in that equilibrium you also had that the producer of wealth was the producer, if you like, of the reflection of that wealth, the money. Now, in the I've got actually going to cut to here a screen here. I'm just going to bring it up, and I find it interesting. The history of the tally sticks in Britain was a method whereby the parliaments, the government, the king, if you like, were able to call on services from the community, and based on those services, they could have work done, and this was a reflection of that getting that work done, and then of course the community could use these sticks as a method of buying other services themselves, and so the issuer of the sticks, as I understand it, was the monarch, was the governmental system at the time, and this changed, and it changed significantly around the time of the is it what 1694, the formation of the Bank of England. I think it's very important to understand that the tally sticks were actually burnt. I'm actually going to cut across once more to a screen. I've got a picture of a book here. The tally sticks were actually burnt, and in the course of burning those tally sticks to convert to the new system, they burnt Parliament down unintentionally. But I think it's actually metaphorically or spiritually they burnt Parliament down too, because its locus standi, its legitimacy as Parliament, when it handed over the sovereignty of if you like, credit creation, they handed it over to private interests, and I think it's appropriate that Parliament did burn down, because they had no right, they had no right to hand that over to private interests, but they did, and of course the fraud from that point on continued, and money creation for in the last 400 longer, apart from the bank receipts, which was an opportunity for fraud and minor fraud, money creation has got to the stage now where we have the entire world owes these money creators, central bankers, individual people, individual persons. The entire world owes its entire production for 3 years. We produced non-stop for 3 years, and in order to pay the debt. Now hang on a sec. Where's the reflection of reality? We have disconnected. We have disconnected. The entire world is in debt. Our governments, our individuals, our industry is in debt to these central bankers. 3 years complete production of the entire world to basically a handful of people. It's disconnected from reality. It does not reflect the real world. Betty.
That's quite right, Arnie. And one of the reasons is because the system, the financial system, is quite separate from the rest of the systems of the real world. And in my thinking, I've tried to understand how it is that people can't see this. And just the same as the money system and the evolution of that money system is important to understand, so is also the evolution of people's own thinking. And I've spent the weekend thinking about this, and from my notes I can see a lot of it stems from what happened in Western thought from the 17th century onwards. The scientific revolution, the pioneers in the scientific revolution, such as Descartes and Francis Bacon, laid down the principles. Nature came to be understood in more clinical terms of its mechanics, mechanistic thinking. In the main, science was based on a reductionist approach, and you can see it now in how they teach children. Children are taught to see the human body as the heart as a pump, the lungs as a set of bellows, and now the human mind explained away as the product of an electronic, electromagnetic effect of brain function. And when it comes to defining consciousness or imagination, it becomes very fuzzy. The 18th century shows the agenda of the Enlightenment was based on a pursuit of progress through science and technology. But who questioned that agenda, which was in fact an ideology? And Prince Charles, in his book Harmony, makes a very important point. He said, "It's as if we peer at the world through a letterbox, believing that what science reveals is the whole picture. Even though science itself does not deal with the meaning of things." And that to me is very important, the meaning of things. It was C.H. Douglas who pointed out that the purpose, the true purpose of a money system, it is simply a means by which we deal with things. It has no life in itself. And I think that is important. And the great yawning gap in our understanding of how we human beings fit within the scheme of things, within the real world. We actually censor or block what our intuition might be telling us. And Ian McGilchrist, again I quote him because he's got a lot to say that I think we should learn about. He deals with the left hemisphere domination, dominance that is there in our minds today. And he says, they don't know what they don't know. I thought, and that sentence has stuck with me. And it just reminded me of when Jesus was on the cross, when he said, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do."
Thank you, Betty. I'm going to give the floor to Wally to continue on. Thank you, Wally.
Well, of course, you know, scientists are very much disinclined to venture into the area of values. Science wants to maintain what it considers to be its objectivity in merely observing things and explaining things in terms of what they uncover by their observations and their investigations. And of course, that is fine as far as it goes, but does that answer the ultimate questions about life? Human consciousness. Is human consciousness like you and me? Are we simply discrete, separated awarenesses? Or are we something that actually is part of the unity of consciousness, which constitutes the universe? You see, it's a very difficult question, I admit, but it seems to me that we can properly actually attune ourselves with a consciousness that is pervasive throughout the universe and which mankind has called God or some similar word in order to try and describe this. And if you simply separate us all into discrete units, we become dissociated, and that can be very much of a problem because if there is a unity, that tends to break the unity up, and you lack your overall meaning in the sense of the whole the whole aspect of creation. This is getting into some rather philosophical areas, I know, but money, again, as you said, Betty, it is a tool. It is not the end and be all. It is merely a tool to allow us to function in a certain way within our lives. It doesn't necessarily explain the meaning of our lives. We can use it as a means to explore and attempt to find meanings, but in itself, it's just a tool. It is simply an abstract representation of those physical elements that long ago they used in order to carry on trade and commerce.
Thank you, Wally. I'm just you reminded me then in that stanza that the the fraud that was committed and has been continued to be committed. In fact, the money creation in our world is an absolute atrocious fraud. And the fact is that the swine in the trough include our governments and all that and all vested interests. Anyone who's sort of milking as much as they can out of it for their own benefit, their benefit that they actually derive is at the expense of the real owners of the credit. And this is the point I want to get at. That the real owners of what we're looking at, the custodians of our culture, our history, our technology, our know-how, who are the real owners of that? It's not the central bankers. The real owners of that is everyone. Everyone. This is a gift from God. Knowledge, revelation, understanding, technology, know-how. These are gifts from God, and they belong to everyone. And if we were realistic about our assessment of what a money system or how it should operate, it would be on the basis that and I know you've said it yourself, Wally, the organism is entitled to its sustenance. And so it is with human beings. That people, the community, the individuals in that community, down to the single person, are entitled to sustenance. They're entitled to sufficiency. And when we've got robotics, automation, advanced control, and complete industrialization, nuclear energy, all these huge magnifications of productive capacity, that means that standard of living, that standard of need can be easily met with very little effort. And that's where the money system is failing, because it's there as a means of exploitation, and it shouldn't be. It should be as a measuring stick, like a tally stick, or like a ruler to measure a distance. The money system should be like a ruler to measure the productive capacity of what the community can produce, and then ensure that there is a sufficiency for the individuals in that community. Betty.
Arnie, in thinking about it, I was reminded of when I first started to try to understand the money system. I had to go back to the tithing system to see the physical reality, and I am reminded that in the tithing system you realise that if the community has a bad year, everyone has to pull in their belt. And if they have a good year, then everyone enjoys from the abundance, because the Old Testament tithing system was based on the 10%, which was paid in kind to the temple. And from that, of course, the priests and all of the what I call the state administrators would benefit from it, but so did the widows and the children. And so another thing I also realized when thinking of it that way, there is no debt in nature. You can't produce next year's or this year's crop with next year's rain. You just have to do without if there's a drought. So if we can get people to think in a different way, then we would have a major breakthrough.
Thank you, Betty. That's most important, and that to me is where the McGilchrist and Tweedies come into it, because they assist us in understanding the actual function of the brain, and they highlight the difference between the hemispheres, and how if you do orientate to a left hemisphere numbers and things. An apple is so many cents. Well, is it? Or is it really its nourishment? And it's actually a source of life, a life force from the garden. And that to me is a better way of looking at it instead of numbers, but as a life force. And so it is that the world around us is where we actually garnish our life force, our sustenance. Wally.
Well, Arnie, you have said that our wealth is a gift from God or nature. Let us be under no illusion. Today, under the financial system we operate, it is largely a gift from the banking system because the banking system claims the ownership of the credit that it creates. And that credit simply represents the actual real wealth, productive capacity, the real credit of society. It's got nothing to do with the banking system. Well, the banking system does provide some services and with regard to the transfer of accounts and that sort of thing. But the banking system, by and large, most certainly does not create the real wealth of the community. And yet, if you don't repay a loan, they will foreclose on that assets that you have pledged in respect of the loan. Now, do they give it back to the community? No, they do not. So you can see that, as I've said before, the communists move into the capitalists with a gun, and at the point of the gun, they say, move over, we're taking over. The financial system is much more subtle than that. It goes around and places a perpetual mortgage, which we see in this enormous debt that overhangs society, a perpetual mortgage on the communal capital. Now, the difference is only in technique. It's still centralized control of the credit of the community. And when you have centralized control of the credit of the community, you have the power to dictate what people produce and what they will consume and so on and so forth. Now, there are differences between absolute direct physical administration and financial administration. But the difference is some people say that the financial system is more desirable, but in a way it's less desirable, or it certainly is not desirable because it is subtle and it's something that the average person does not understand, and he or she is having the wool pulled over his or her eyes. They don't realize what's happening. So what they're doing, they're trying to service these debts, which are actually fraudulent and being created at a greater and greater rate, and people are running faster and faster on this treadmill, desperately trying to serve the requirements of these debts, just running faster and faster, willy-nilly, without really knowing what they're doing. They don't realize that the debts merely represent money which has been filched prematurely through prices and which actually should have been credited to the community in lower prices and increased purchasing power at the time that the transaction was made. They have no idea what's happening. People will ask, well, who do we actually own this or owe this money to? You'll hear people say that sometimes, but it doesn't provide an answer. It does provide that they have a little spark of curiosity that is probably healthy, but we have to go a lot further than that and understand that the banking system has appropriated the communal capital. They have taken that which is not theirs. They should simply be an accountancy system which simply records for our convenience what we do in the way of producing and consuming.
Thank you, Wally. That's a beautiful summary, and I see clearly in my mind, and I hope the viewers do too, that the purpose of a national dividend and a consumer price discount is so that it is a reflection of the productive capacity of the community, and it's an entitlement, it's an inheritance. It belongs to the individuals in the community. It does not belong to the central bankers. The central bankers have usurped it. This is where usury comes into it. They have stolen it and they filch it, whatever the word is. They do it every single day. Every time there's another loan, and I look on the debts of my children, my grandchildren, and where I would look at buying a block of land and it would take a year or two to pay for, and they're now looking at 10 years to pay for a block of land quarter the size. And a house, instead of taking 5 or 7 years to pay for, it's generational. They won't pay for it. It will be handed over to their children and their children's children. And the sad part is that the standard of houses is such that they're designed to be obsolete. Their life cycle is not 100 years; it's not 50 years. You know, the life cycle of the homes being built today is a lot less than that, and it's really frustrating because they will never ever get off this treadmill, and it's been usurped. It's a con. It's a fraud. And anyway, we're running out of time, and I just look for closing comments, Betty.
Well, I would just like to say that along with Prince Charles, we can't look at life or the world simply through a letterbox, and things cannot be understood in isolation.
Thank you, Betty. And sorry, I've just got to lost control of the driving wheel there. Just closing comments, Wally, please. Wally.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, yes, we have an inheritance. We definitely have an inheritance. If you look at nature, no one would deny an organism the right to consume for its means of living or life, maintenance of life, when something is obviously available and at hand. And yet in our artificial economy, which is money driven, you can't really do anything without money because everybody demands money and everything is legally backed by the demand to money. You cannot live unless you use money. And if someone has the control of the money, which is essential to all transactions, then they have control of you essentially. And it's wrong because it has taken away the tremendous abundance that nature provides and has taken control of it and has taken control of the ability to apportion it out to individuals when in fact it should be freely available to individuals. It's their inheritance. The debt that is outstanding is money that is our inheritance that has been stolen. And I don't know what you do to make people realize that, but until they realize it, we are not going to come to a satisfactory resolution of our problems. And not only that, our problems are going to become increasingly intensified. And the situation does not look very hopeful in that, looking at it from that perspective. What is going to be the end result of all this? We must demand our inheritance. And there is nothing wrong about it, demanding our inheritance, because there is nothing. The assumption is behind all of this that human beings create all wealth, and therefore that everything that is consumed must be uh, distributed on the basis of an obligation to someone else who has created it. And in fact, so much of the creation of wealth today is due to non-labor factors. If you could show that human beings created all wealth, then there would be a basis for the claim that you cannot eat unless you labor. But that is ridiculous. It's not, it's just simply ridiculous on the face of it because we know that human beings, human effort is an increasingly smaller factor of production in the modern economy. So you have to adjust your distributive system to accommodate that fact. And the way to adjust it is to ensure that everything is distributed to everyone, whether or not, in the aggregate as a society, whether they're working or not. And that's the way it has to be done. And if people can't get that through their head, that puritanical notion that people must be directed and forced to comply, forced to perform certain functions before they can enjoy any aspect of life, they're going to have to get over that because it is absolutely a wrong conception. And unfortunately, it comes from the fact today that we're not getting enough income. And the way that they try to solve it today is to tax the insufficient income in order to redistribute the wealth. And that is simply a consequence of the defective nature of the financial system itself, which fails to distribute everything that is produced in each cycle of production as it's produced dynamically to consumers.
Thank you, Wally. That's an excellent summary. The indebtedness that we find ourselves in, and in actual fact, you know, we go to something like the world clock to look at it, and it reinforces the point that if we've got this world clock and it continues to go further and further into debt, you ask the question, who do we owe this to? And when it's at the stage of 3 complete years of production of every single person who's working in the world, every single machine, 3 complete years of production are owed to central bankers. And that's you've got to put it in perspective. That does not reflect reality. They're not deserving of it. And the fact is, the distributive system, this is what Douglas highlighted nearly 100 years ago. A distributive system he demonstrated and he explained the mechanism. If someone comes up with a better method, that's fine. He'll step aside. But the point is that there has to be a method of distribution. And that's what social credit is advocating. And that is the bounty that comes back from the loaves and fishes. What did those people on that mountain do? They did nothing. They were just there. And yet they were fed. There was plenty, and there was plenty left over. And that's the abundance that's there. That's the real world, and we have to open our eyes to see it. The veil has to come off. The real world is there is an abundance. And the financial world just shows this debt, and enslavement, financial enslavement for years and years and years to come. They're two poles apart. And the fact is that the political systems that are in front of us, the communist system, the capitalist system, they're both using this to control us. This is Arnie Lukes from the Crossroads, and I hope you've enjoyed today's session. It's been very good. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, will come a waltzing Matilda with me.